very much. Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone for joining. So I'm a journalist based in Istanbul, and I report on a region where democracy is not doing so well. So in some of the countries that I cover, democracy has never really been the case, such as Iran, the Middle East, parts of the Caucasus. But in others like Hungary and much of the Balkans and Turkey, where I'm based, the retreat is far more recent. In fact, only a decade ago, the US and the European Union were congratulating themselves on having helped these countries in Central and Eastern Europe break free of dictatorship and progress towards liberalism, pluralism, and the rule of law. Some of these countries have even joined the European Union and NATO, but the siren call of populism now seems to be pulling them back towards their autocratic pasts. There's a number of reasons why that's happening, which I'm not going to go into too much, only to say that the regression began before the era of Donald Trump. But what is clear is that Trump's tenure in the White House and his willingness to look the other way as these populist autocrats have accelerated their crackdowns on the media and extended their hold over the state has emboldened and enabled them. We're now in a position where democracy is in crisis right the way across Europe's eastern flank. According to Freedom House, there are now fewer consolidated democracies in Central and Eastern Europe than at any time since 1995, which is when the organisation was founded. So in Turkey, Serbia and Hungary, which are the countries that I'm going to largely focus on today, my local colleagues, journalists, are intimidated, sacked, accused of coup plotting, terrorism, or illegally insulting their leaders simply for reporting the news that those in power do not want to be heard. In Turkey, there are 64 journalists in prison at the moment, some of them having been there for years awaiting trial. Critical news outlets have been taken over by force and handed to businessmen sympathetic to the government, or they're shut down entirely. The spaces for critical reporting are shrinking rapidly. In Turkey, the government has also passed a law that will make it easier for them to restrict and censor what is posted to social media. And I should add here that the social media companies, despite their insistences on freedom of expression when it comes to criticisms about hate speech on their platforms, have chosen to comply with Turkey's new law. And they've set up local offices that will respond to requests from the courts to remove content that is deemed offensive by the Turkish government. Let's not kid ourselves that the courts in these countries are independent. The independence of the judiciaries has been eroded in Turkey through a wholesale purge following a coup attempt against President Erdogan in 2016. That has led to more than a third of the country's judges and prosecutors being removed and replaced with individuals loyal to Erdogan. The result of that is that we're now seeing cases going through the courts in which secret witnesses are called, and lawyers for the defendants are not allowed to see key evidence on their files. One human rights lawyer told me recently that the rule of law in Turkey is now in a worse state even than it was following the coup of 1980, when the country was ruled by a military junta. In Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán passed legal reforms in 2012 that extended the influence of his government over the judiciary. Prosecutors who try to remain independent are subject to attacks in the media and from politicians. In Serbia, Parliament has the power to appoint judges to the Supreme Court, and long-promised reforms have not come to pass. Prosecutors now act largely according to the will of President Vučić. In all three of these countries, these leaders are using jingoism, rhetoric against minorities and migrants, and in Turkey's case, launching military operations to shore up their domestic support. They use bully boy tactics to quash their domestic opponents. Just this week, I've reported how, following weeks of statements from Erdogan and his nationalist allies, Turkish prosecutors have filed a case to close down the country's main Kurdish party and stripped one of its deputies of his parliamentary seat. And how in Serbia, Vučić is using violent right-wing groups to attack opposition politicians. These leaders have built political, military and economic ties with Russia and China, even though they're members of NATO in the case of Turkey and Hungary, an EU member in the case of Hungary, and EU candidates in the case of Turkey and Serbia, with all the financial, security and diplomatic benefits that those statuses bring. Donald Trump treated these strongmen as friends, confidants and inspirations. He said of Orban, "It's like we're twins." When Erdogan launched a cross-border military operation in Syria in October 2019, targeting Kurdish militias that were fighting ISIS alongside US forces, Trump wrote him a letter offering to make a deal. He invited Vučić to the White House to put his seal of approval on a land swap deal that he negotiated with the Kosovan president Hashim Thaçi in backroom meetings that were widely opposed in both countries, as well as by diplomats and opposition groups in the region. Thaçi was indicted for war crimes at The Hague as he was on his way to that meeting. Both he and Vučić have been planning to use their reception in Washington with Donald Trump as an image polishing stunt back home. So this is the situation that Biden has inherited. It's telling that all of these leaders made their preference for Trump clear before the November elections and appeared confident that he'd win. And Erdogan and his circle were so convinced that Trump would take a second term that as late as October, they were still hiring Republican lobbyists through their various US-based organizations. During the campaigning, Orban's foreign minister repeated and gave credence to the discredited conspiracy theories about Hunter Biden's links to Ukraine. So when the election was called for Biden, there was tangible shock in my region. Vučić and Orban did eventually congratulate him, but only after publicly casting doubt on the veracity of the count in Vučić's case. Erdogan still has not offered any congratulations. As Trump was launching his various attempts to challenge the election results, first through the courts and then by rousing the mob that attacked the Senate on January the 6th, it was clear that he was drawing inspiration from these autocratic leaders. In 2019, Erdogan managed to cancel the result of local elections here in Istanbul by putting pressure on the Supreme Electoral Board, which ordered a rerun of the vote. In the end, that resulted in a huge setback for Erdogan, since the opposition candidate won again with a hugely increased margin, but it showed the level of control that Erdogan has over state institutions in Turkey. The independence and strength of the US's institutions and its media was what prevented Trump from doing the same. These leaders were unsettled by Biden's win because they know that it signals the end of a period in which America was not exerting its democratic influence on the rest of the world. The past 4 years have shown us that that matters, because if the US is not exerting influence, then others will fill the void. In particular, President Putin has expanded Russia's military and political presence in Syria, Libya, and the Caucasus, as well as courting countries that are, on paper, Western allies. Most pressingly, he's managed to convince Erdogan to buy the Russian-made S-400 missile defense system, which has opened up a rift at the heart of the NATO alliance and brought US sanctions down on Turkey. The Kremlin has also supported far-right and anti-immigrant groups across Europe and fueled COVID and vaccine conspiracy theories. It has hired tech-savvy teenagers in poor countries in the Balkans to produce and propagate fake news stories, which helped to shift the outcome of the 2016 US election, and it attempted to do so again in 2020. The decline of US influence in the region has only been exacerbated by the absence of the European Union, which has been distracted by its own internal crises in the past half-decade, principally over migration and Brexit. The bloc has spent years and billions of dollars in the Balkans in particular, trying to heal the wounds of the conflicts of the 1990s. And yet, in recent years, it has left the region afloat, with accession processes on hold and populations wondering whether the promise of European integration is actually a sham. That has left these states vulnerable to Russia's campaigns of misinformation and propaganda, as well as attempts by China to expand its influence. Biden and his team have made it clear that they're not going to, Biden and his team have made it clear that they're going to bring democracy overseas back onto the US agenda. So far, Biden has not spoken directly to Erdogan, Vučić, or oil ban, although there have been indirect contacts and at the ministerial level. This week, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is in Brussels for the meeting of NATO's foreign secretaries. And it's the first time he has come face to face with the foreign ministers of Turkey and Hungary. In a live stream event before that meeting, Blinken spoke with Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, and emphasised that the new US administration is going to seek to strengthen the transatlantic alliance in order to counter the threats of Russian expansionism, climate change, cyber warfare, and nuclear proliferation, among others. And in order to do that, it will seek to reverse the anti-democratic trends of the past few years in the countries it counts as allies or potential allies. Both Stoltenberg and Blinken acknowledge that there are differences and concerns with Turkey in particular, but stress that NATO could be a platform where these are discussed and mediated. I'm going to take a look at each of these three countries separately now and examine how the Biden administration might approach each as it tries to encourage them to halt on their path towards autocracy and to return to Western democratic norms and the rule of law. I'm also going to touch briefly on Iran, which is another country where Trump abandoned the policies of his predecessor, but this time by charging in the other direction. He was heavily influenced by Iran hawks in his team, and he dismantled the 2015 nuclear deal, which had been brokered by Barack Obama. That deal had won guarantees from Iran that it would not develop a nuclear weapon, and in return, the US eased its sanctions on Tehran. But from 2018 onwards, Trump reimposed those embargoes and swathes more, and Tehran has again ramped up its nuclear program, now to beyond the level that it was before the deal was signed. Make no mistake about it, Iran is a rogue regime which oppresses its own people and poses a significant danger to the region and the world. The sanctions that Trump levied have dealt a huge blow to its economy, sending the value of the rial plummeting and inflation soaring. That has sparked rounds of protests inside Iran, but it has done little to weaken the regime, whose crackdown on its own people is only escalating. The number of Iranian dissidents crossing the border into Turkey with people smugglers more than doubled from 2018 to 2019. But meanwhile, the Iranian elites and those connected to the regime can easily find ways around the sanctions. Here in Istanbul, there are countless money-changing offices where you can wire money in and out of Iran despite the embargoes. And Iranians are the biggest purchasers of Turkish citizenship through property investment, which allows them to take a Turkish passport and an entirely new name by buying property in Turkey with a value of just $250,000 or more. One Iranian exile in the city of Izmir told me recently that he'd seen people he knows to be linked to the regime in Tehran in a neighborhood there popular with Iranians. And there has been a string of assassinations of dissidents here in Istanbul. Back inside Iran, the regime has started experimenting with cryptocurrencies as a way to swerve the sanctions, as well as seeking trade deals with other states under embargoes or the threat of them, including Russia, China, Venezuela, and Turkey. As this Iranian example shows, a policy of maximum pressure is not necessarily an effective way to change behaviour. Biden has said that he wants to reinstate the nuclear deal, and it is also in Iran's interest to move back towards dialogue. But the outright adversity of the Trump era, heightened by the assassination in January 2020 of Qasem Soleimani, who was the head of the Quds Force and the power behind Iran's military expansion in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, has made it difficult for quick progress to be made on that. Biden is insisting that Iran must wind down its nuclear program again before sanctions are lifted, while Tehran is insisting that the sanctions must be lifted first. However, there are signs that the embargoes are starting to be eased, including talks on a $5 billion IMF loan to fund COVID-related medical imports to Iran, which had been blocked by the Trump administration, and possible sanctions waivers to allow some Iranian bank accounts in Iraq, Korean, and Omani banks to be unfrozen to provide funds for humanitarian account to pay for food and medicine imports into the country. This will hopefully help build confidence and open a space for dialogue, although at present the rhetoric is still high and there remains a high threat of Iranian attacks on US military bases in Iraq and shipping in the Persian Gulf. So let's next turn to Hungary, which is both an EU and NATO member. Here, Biden has not only inherited a problem from Trump, but also difficulties relating to his own party. Viktor Orban has said that he views the US Democrats' liberal and internationalist agenda as one of moral imperialism, believing that they have no right to interfere in the governance of other countries. Barack Obama outright shunned Orban when he was president, refusing bilateral meetings as Orban's authoritarian tendencies grew. The Biden team is also starting off on something of a personalised bad foot. Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, has Hungarian ancestry, and his father was the US ambassador to the country. He's also an emeritus trustee of the Central European University. This was the prestigious institution set up in Budapest by the financier George Soros, himself a Hungarian who has used his fortune to set up projects to advance liberal democratic societies, including the Open Societies Foundation. Perhaps inevitably, Soros has become a scapegoat for some of the strongmen that we're discussing today. In Turkey, there are civil society activists in jail today who have come under suspicion due to their links to Soros, and Erdogan refers to Soros with unconcealed overtones of anti-Semitism. And in Hungary, Orban accuses Soros of working to destroy national sovereignty with a pro-migration agenda. He's put his picture on billboards across the country with the slogan "Thief," and in his speeches makes references to his being the puppet master of a shadowy global network. In 2019, the Central European University was stripped by Orban's government of its ability to grant US degrees. And as a result, the university has left Hungary and re-established itself in Vienna. The huge irony in all of this is that Soros supported Orban back in the early 1990s, when the country was emerging from communism and Orban was a pro-democracy activist. Trump did and said nothing, as the Central European University was hounded out of Budapest. Had Biden been in the White House then, the US approach would certainly have been different. During his campaign, Biden repeatedly mentioned Hungary as one of the countries where autocracy is taking hold. But it is difficult to see how Biden can begin to negotiate with Orban on issues like the university. He's starting off on the back foot here, and he needs to build up some areas where he can exert pressure on Orban. The reaffirmation of US commitment to NATO could be one of those areas. Although Orban has built warm ties with Russia and China, he is still aware of the protection and security that membership of the alliance offers Hungary. Another area could be trade. While Trump and Orban share a warm personal relationship, Trump's protectionist trade policy and his trade war with the EU was actually bad for the Hungarian economy. Serbia presents something of a different prospect. Trump's personal relations with Vučić were not as warm as they were with Orban, but here Biden does not have NATO as a shared platform. Indeed, Serbia is actively hostile to NATO due to the alliance's bombing of Belgrade in 1999 during the Kosovan War. If you go to Belgrade today, you'll still find the former headquarters of Radio Television Serbia in the city centre left exactly as it was on the day it was bombed, and hung with banners covered in slogans against NATO and the US. This is a resentment that burns strong, and it's extremely useful for Putin, since Russia backed Serbia in that conflict. In fact, on the 20th anniversary of the 1999 bombing, a blockbuster film about the Kosovan War, jointly produced by Russian and Serbian production companies, and giving a not entirely accurate account of events, topped the box office in both countries. But more recently, Serbia's relationship with Russia has cooled somewhat, and the country is a candidate for EU membership. If Biden can help nudge along Serbia's talks with Kosovo, albeit in a different form to the backroom talks on a land swap that Trump gave his seal of approval to, then he may be able to gain some traction in Belgrade. At the moment, though, Biden is viewed in both Belgrade and Pristina, the Kosovan capital, as a firmly pro-Kosovo president. Last month, he sent a letter to Vučić congratulating Serbia on its National Day, in which he encouraged mutual recognition with Kosovo to help both on the path to European integration. Vučić responded tartly, saying that Serbian recognition of Kosovo is not on the table. Added to that, Kosovo's parliamentary elections last month resulted in a clear victory for Albin Kurti, himself an overtly pro-Western, pro-EU, pro-liberal figure. On the other hand, Kurti is extremely hawkish on Serbia, insisting that they have still not accounted for their crimes during the War of '99. He opposes the indictment of former President Thaci by a court at The Hague and has previously advocated for a Kosovan union with Albania. He may be pro-US and pro-Biden, but it is not going to be easy for either the US or the EU to get him to the negotiating table with Vučić. Here again, though, trade may provide a lever which Biden can pull in Belgrade. One positive outcome of the talks between Vučić and former Kosovan President Abdullah Hoti in the White House last year was an economic cooperation deal between Belgrade and Pristina. Serbia is also expanding its trade ties with the US. It's about to open a third consulate there and a trade office on the West Coast to build ties with the tech industry. A new agreement signed on January the 21st means that the US International Development Finance Corporation, which invests in private companies, will soon launch operations in Serbia. The Serbian Chamber of Commerce has also made a number of visits to the US since 2019 and hired lobbyists there to promote economic relations. The new Serbian ambassador, Marko Đurić, took up post in December. He is extremely close to Vučić and a former deputy with his party. He has also previously headed Serbia-Kosovo talks, as well as being an unofficial liaison with Likud party in Israel, the CCP in China, and Putin's United Russia. His appointment to the US is seen as a message from Vučić that he wants to build closer ties with Washington. Finally, let's go to the most important and most challenging country of the three, and the one which I'm most deeply involved in as a journalist, Turkey. It's been a NATO member since 1952, in a customs union with the EU since 1995, and a candidate for full membership of the bloc since 1999. Yet of these three countries, it is the one that is ranked by Freedom House as not free. I've written about Turkey's democratic decline over the past decade and the reasons behind it, both in my newspaper and in my book, Erdogan Rising. It's a long and complex story that is still evolving. So here I'm just going to focus on the current areas of conflict with the US, which at the moment reads a little bit like a shopping list. There's Turkey's purchase of the S-400 missile system and its attacks on Kurdish militias in Syria, which I've mentioned already. There are other regional conflicts in which Biden has already taken a side against Turkey, including its dispute with Greece and Cyprus in the Eastern Mediterranean, which nearly spilled into outright conflict last summer. There is also the case against Halkbank, a Turkish state-owned bank which is accused of helping Iran evade sanctions through a scheme sanctioned by members of Erdogan's government, including Erdogan himself. The case was delayed after Trump personally intervened on Erdogan's behalf, but it's due to come before the Southern District of New York courthouse in June. This is a really bleak picture. Analysts and former Turkish diplomats have described it to me as the worst relations have ever been between Turkey and the US. And it is clear that Biden is not going to allow Erdogan to keep behaving the way he has recently with no consequences. Primarily, his administration views Turkey through the lens of Russia. One of their chief concerns is pushing back against Russia's military expansionism, and that includes punishing Turkey for buying the S-400 system, which poses the threat that information on NATO equipment will be leaked to the Kremlin. Turkey has already been told that it cannot have NATO's next generation F-35 fighter jet while it still has the 400. This week, the outgoing US ambassador to Turkey, David Satterfield, reiterated that this row cannot be resolved unless Turkey gets rid of the S-400. But Ankara is still insisting that that will not happen, and so here they are at an impasse. Moreover, Biden has signalled that he's concerned about the erosion of human rights within Turkey. Since his inauguration at the State Department, he has issued a number of statements condemning moves in Ankara, including the case to close the HDP, the main Kurdish party, the scrapping of the Istanbul Agreement against gender-based violence, and the continuing detention of civil society activists. Each of these has met with a dismissive response from Ankara. In the first couple of months after Biden's win, Erdogan did signal that he wanted to mend bridges with the US and with the EU. However, since he appears to have been met with a cold shoulder, he is now pressing ahead however he likes at home, with little heed for the consequences, as well as openly praising Putin earlier this week during his row with Biden. So herein lies the problem for the new president. However much you may dislike Erdogan, Turkey is too important an ally to lose. It sits in between Russia, Europe, and the Middle East, and it will be vital to NATO as the alliance tries to push back against the Kremlin. So it is in US interests to bring Turkey back into the Western fold. That's not to say that Biden should give Erdogan or any of the region's other strongmen a free pass to do what they like at home, so long as they remain staunch allies. But he must balance the stick with the carrot. While their ideologies and religions may differ, the personalities of these autocratic leaders are strikingly similar. That's why they get on so well. They play up to their macho images, they revel in surliness, they imagine themselves as iconoclasts. In Erdogan's case, he has ambitions to be a figurehead not just for Turks, but for Muslims around the world. What these leaders cannot stand is to be humiliated or to be made to look weak, particularly by a US president. Biden must also realise that there is a powerful existing undercurrent of popular anti-Americanism in this region, which cuts across party lines and which these leaders can play on if they feel like they have been humiliated or not treated as equal partners by the US. Their almost total control of local media means that they can present disputes almost however they like. One example is a news story from Turkey last year when pro-government media dug up a video of Joe Biden calling on Turks to support the opposition. This drew condemnation not just from Erdogan's supporters, but also from the opposition parties who resented what they saw as interference and patronisation from the US. There are smarter ways to support the opposition in countries where democracy is in retreat, and it starts at the grassroots in civil society. There are journalists in Turkey, Serbia, and Hungary who can no longer find outlets to publish their work in. Funding to investigative and reporting projects can ensure that journalists can continue holding these governments to account, and pressure groups can keep monitoring and pushing back against social issues such as xenophobia, environmental degradation, corruption, and violence against women and minorities. Meanwhile, at the diplomatic level, the US needs to engage and do so intelligently. It is no use simply blanking these leaders, as Biden has done so far. All the signs that came from the region when he won the US elections show that these leaders also need his support, even if they would have preferred Trump in the White House. And finally, a thought about the not too distant future. There will be a time, although it doesn't feel like it now, when Erdogan, Orbán, and Vučić are no longer in power. Their popular support has already waned, and people are itching for something different. They're resorting to fear tactics now because they know that they can no longer command respect. Their economies are failing, and they are looking increasingly out of touch with their people. While it's a tragedy that countries that were so recently democratizing are backsliding, it also makes it easier for them to reverse course once again. the populations of these countries have recent memories of what it's like to live in a country that is expanding its freedoms, not retracting them. They do not need much persuasion to go back to that. But it's in Biden's hands not to mishandle the next few years, or to allow these strong men to become so disconnected from the West that they throw off any facade that they might have left of democracy. If Biden can manage to keep them on side, then a decade from now, we might again be talking about how they've pulled themselves back from dictatorship. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. And obviously, questions are welcome. But I'm a bit curious about two interrelated things. Is that you say Turkey or Erdogan knows that Turkey is too important for every side, and so that's probably not likely that it will be expelled from NATO. That's why it's there to like purchase weapons from Russia and insist on keeping those weapons despite oppositions from US, right? And under the Biden administrations, and I guess Biden's administration also has a lot on its plate. And do you think that that's why probably the US would not be doing so much to affect the domestic policies of Turkey, even if it would have play a bigger role in shaping its foreign relations? That's the first things. And secondly, is about domestically. You mentioned quite a lot about the situation of the media sector there, and laws or policies have been made to target journalists, and they were prosecuted. From your personal perspective, do you think that? So, how's the situation of journalists in Turkey? Local domestic journalists treat how differently from like foreign correspondents like you in Turkey?
Okay. Yeah, so looking first at the issue of Turkey and NATO and Russia, what is really, really clear is that Vladimir Putin has played a really clever game with Turkey over the past 5 years. He sensed that there was the beginnings of a rift. The rift actually between Turkey and the US dates back a really long way. It dates back to 2003, when Turkey refused to join the US coalition in Iraq. That was the kind of the seeds of a rift, but it's really grown over the past 5 years, particularly since the US has been backing Kurdish militias in Syria. Now, Putin has really, really cleverly utilized that. It's in, a lot of people often ask me, you know, does Putin want Turkey to leave NATO? I don't think he does. What is really useful for Putin is to have NATO constantly distracted by conversations over whether Turkey is going to leave NATO, right? When you've got this constant kind of debate and argument and rift going on, then the alliance suddenly looks weak, and it looks like, you know, it can't really manage its internal affairs, and that's great for Putin. That's great for him as he looks to either to sort of wield himself in the region to express Russian foreign policy in places like Georgia or like the Crimea, or further afield in places like Syria. It's really, really useful for him because it means that NATO is constantly distracted and perhaps not pushing back as effectively as it might.
Weaken it from within, I guess is what probably Russia think is a good way to sort of weaken NATO or the Western alliance from within, because as you say, there's no real realistic chance that Turkey will be expelled from NATO. It's far too important.
It just won't be. I mean, the reason why it was asked to join wasn't, you know, necessarily that all its values are completely in line with America's or European, and in fact that's not the point of NATO. You know, NATO isn't the EU. It's not necessarily about, you know, human rights or, you know, everyone thinking the same way. It's a military and security alliance, right? And you just have to look at where Turkey is. You know, basically it's exactly at the waypoint between the old Soviet Union, the Middle East and Europe. So it's strategically can't overstate its importance. Now, unfortunately, that also creates something of a problem because Erdogan knows that very, very well. And I think he sort of knows very well that he's never going to be kicked out, and therefore he feels kind of empowered to do things like get the S-400 system. Now, the challenge for Biden is how do you go about, on the one hand, punishing that kind of bad behavior, and the US administration has made it really clear that Turkey is not going to be allowed to take delivery of the new generation NATO fighter jet unless it gets rid of the S-400. But on the other side, how do you try and flip him away from Putin again? How do you try and bring Turkey back into the fold? Or is it simply a case of just hanging on in there until Erdogan is gone? You know, as I said at the end, you know, Erdogan is not forever. You know, it's at some point, one way or the other, that he's not going to be in charge of Turkey. And then, you know, almost everyone that I talk to is pretty confident that once there is a kind of change of government in Turkey, that things will actually get back to normal fairly quickly. So, you know, one option for Biden could be, you know, could we just sort of sit this out and make sure he doesn't go too far, but, you know, accept that we're never going to kind of get him back on side as, you know, a wholehearted good ally. And the second question, yeah, to do with media. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, is there a difference between the way that foreign media and local media are treated? Yeah, absolutely there is. You know, 64 Turkish journalists in prison, no foreign journalists. I mean, there's
any of them working for foreign media, like, or mostly they are from local Turkish.
Local. There have been a couple of occasions where you've had dual citizens who work for foreign media facing court cases. So there was a Wall Street Journal journalist who's dual national, she's half Turkish, who faced a court case and had to leave the country for a long time. And also a German Turkish journalist, the same thing happened to him. But yeah, I mean, generally they're picking on Turkish citizens, and what they particularly don't like is critical reporting in Turkish, because that's obviously what people in Turkey can read and what might affect the thinking of the Turkish population. As foreign journalists publishing in foreign outlets, we have more freedom for sure. You know, most of us at this point are publishing, you know, almost uniformly critical reports, because what else can you do at this point, really? I mean, they certainly don't like it, and we certainly get, you know, phone calls from annoyed officials, and we will, for example, I quite regularly sort of get cut off from being invited to, you know, meetings and things like that. But yeah, definitely there's a larger space for the foreign media to operate. And what's really interesting, there's a new weekly newspaper in Turkish launched a few months ago. It's unusual because it's unusual generally to see new newspapers launching anyway, but they have an economics section, and they've syndicated the Financial Times. So they're taking Financial Times articles and translating them into Turkish. And I think that sort of tells you something about the kind of the bigger space that foreign media have at this point than Turkish media.
I see. And we got a question from a participant, and she asked, it is a bit about another topic, is about what's the current situation of the refugees, like at those at the Syria-Turkish border. How are they affected by this COVID pandemic? Because we all know that somehow the European Union relies on Turkey to deal with that huge influx of refugees, right?
Yeah, I mean, in much the same way as Erdogan knows he's got a trump card over NATO, he knows he's got a trump card over the EU. There's almost 4 million, between 3.5 and 4 million Syrians in Turkey at the moment. It's by far and away the biggest refugee hosting nation in the world. And the European Union is very keen for those people to stay in Turkey and to not come to Europe. And it's done a number of things, including handing Turkey a lot of money in order to make sure that that's the case. And Erdogan very openly uses this. So every so often he will turn around to the EU and say, give me more money or I open the borders, or do this or I open the borders. It is a pretty sickening thing to see people being used in such a way, I have to say. The situation for the Syrians in Turkey, okay, if we put it in the context of other countries in the region that are hosting a lot of Syrians, so principally Jordan and Lebanon, definitely the kind of material situation of Syrians is a lot better here. There's the kind of standard of the camps that the Turkish government has created is a lot better. Syrians are not forced to live in camps here, they can also live in the community. However, it's a really, really insecure situation. Most Turks are not particularly happy that there are so many refugees here and that they've been here for so long. And Erdogan has increasingly started saying things about the Syrians at some point having to go back. He's saying they can't stay here forever. It's becoming increasingly difficult for Syrians to get the paperwork that they need to stay. Almost impossible for them to get work permits to work legally. So most of them are working kind of under the counter in factories or in restaurants or on farms where they're, paid very, very little, well below minimum wage. More than half of Syrian children here are not in school. It's a pretty bleak situation. And with COVID, and as well as the Syrians on this side of the border, there are also huge camps just on the Syrian side as well, where a lot of people who are escaping Assad's bombing, which is still continuing, by the way, have ended up there. And those camps really are bleak. I mean, it's, people literally kind of living under canvas. I mean, a lot was, when the COVID-19 pandemic started, a lot of people were really kind of concerned about what might happen in Syria, because obviously the healthcare system, particularly in opposition-controlled areas, is just almost non-existent. I mean, it's in a really dire circumstance. Actually, for whatever reason, we've not heard so much about the COVID-19 pandemic in those opposition areas. It might just be for a lack of not being reported and not particularly having the facilities for testing. Certainly in the areas that Assad still controls, it's been really, really bleak there. There's pretty much a media blackout, but the doctors that have spoken to journalists have said, things that we've heard from other places, hospitals overflowing, not enough equipment, not enough ventilators. So I mean, it's exactly what you would imagine of a pandemic occurring in a place where the health system's been almost obliterated by a decade of war.
And yes, and we got one last final question from another participant, and because it seems that we are quite curious about your life and experience as a journalist in Turkey. And that participant asked, what are the biggest problems you have encountered as a female journalist from a foreign country and who is not a Muslim?
In Turkey, it's never really an issue. I mean, Turkey is obviously a Muslim country, but it's also, even after nearly 2 decades of Erdogan, who's a famous Muslim, it's still a secular state. So, I mean, apart from in mosques, there's absolutely nowhere where you would go in Turkey where somebody would try to tell you to cover your head or dress in a certain way. Turks are very, very fiercely and proudly a secular country, even if they are also fiercely and proudly Muslims. It's a different situation, obviously, in places like Iraq and Syria, particularly in areas where there were certain Islamist militias operating. Obviously, the one that everyone probably knows of is ISIS, but then, on a less extreme level, there were all kinds of militias operating in Syria that were Islamist to various degrees and were kind of enforcing, pretty strict Islamic conditions, which included women having to wear headscarves. On the other hand, as a journalist and as a foreigner working in those places, it was actually quite useful. There was a point in Syria in 2012, 2013, where it became really, really dangerous to be a foreign journalist because a lot of us were being kidnapped and being sold to various groups. There was a kind of kidnapping industry that grew in Syria's chaos. There were dozens of foreign journalists kidnapped, but almost exclusively they were men. And we've had various conversations as to why that might have been in the years since. And one of the reasons is because, you know, when you're a woman and you're made to cover your head and you're made to sort of shroud yourself in a black abaya, then you pretty much look like every other woman that's walking around, right? So it's far easier in those circumstances to pick out a foreign man than it is to pick out a foreign woman. So actually, although it's kind of deeply uncomfortable, especially when it's, you know, 40 degrees in the summer, and also kind of insulting when it's not your religious beliefs, actually in the long run it turned out to be quite useful. Also, the other thing about working as a woman in these really conservative Islamic places is you can get access to both sides. There are a few places that I was barred from as a woman, including, you know, a Sharia court on one occasion and mosques and things like that. But on the other hand, I could go and talk to women in their private sphere, which male journalists couldn't do. I could go and hang out with, you know, women and girls as they were talking about things that affected them in ways that they would never talk to male journalists, particularly male journalists from a different culture. So on that level, it was actually quite helpful.
I see. And sorry, perhaps let's have one more quick questions, because another participant asked and about UK, and I guess UK is also, it used to be one of the more enthusiastic advocate for Turkey's accessions to EU membership, right? But now UK is gone from the EU. And what would you think, what will be the UK's policy toward this kind of autocratic powers, including particularly Turkey, after Brexit?
Yeah, I mean the UK, yeah, it was always I guess the strongest supporter of Turkey joining the European Union for a number of different reasons. I have to say, I think that was a good policy. If we're talking about sort of 10, 15 years ago, and I it's one of the things that I and my colleagues often wonder is that if Turkey had joined the European Union, would that have moderated Erdogan? Would that have changed the course of events? We don't know. You can never have an answer. And of course, you look at people like Viktor Orban, Hungary's in the EU and he's still doing whatever he wants. And it seems that the EU has no powers to stop him. But I mean, post-Brexit, there's two things. I mean, firstly, Turkey's lost its main champion in the EU. I mean, Turkey is still officially a candidate country, but it's just out of the picture.
The talk has been suspended, right? The talk has been suspended, I guess.
Sorry?
The negotiation,
Yeah, I mean, the relationship between the EU and Turkey at the moment is just so transactional. It's all to do with, we give you 6 billion euros and you keep the refugees. I mean, that's the level it's on. There's occasionally EU talks about getting it back on track, but I just think at the moment it's just not going to happen. The EU's had its own crises to deal with. It's not in the best position itself. But when it comes post-Brexit, it's looking for trade deals everywhere, and increasingly it's pursuing this kind of really mercantile foreign policy. Number one, it cares about doing trade, and probably number two, it cares about human rights. I mean, whenever I ask UK diplomats about various human rights abuses going on in Turkey and whether they're going to raise it, what they always say is, well, we raise these things behind closed doors. We're not like Germany where we stand up on stage and say things. We say it behind closed doors and we keep our good relationship. Now, on the one hand, there's some sense in that because, as I said before, you have to understand the mentality of these strongmen. they hate being humiliated. If there's one thing that Erdogan can't bear, it's a European leader telling him off. Yeah, and all he does is he reacts against that, and then you get into this kind of constant battle. So, yeah, there is something to be said for making these points behind closed doors, but at the same time, the UK is still happily pressing ahead with fighter jet deals and all kinds of things with Turkey. So it doesn't seem to be particularly punishing it for bad behaviour. I would go as far as to say as the UK is Turkey's last friend in Europe at this point, really.
Not surprisingly, yeah. And thank you, Hannah. We discussed quite a wide range of things apart from the Biden administration's attitude toward Turkey, and it's wonderful. Because I was also an ex-journalist, and I do enjoy you sharing your experience as a journalist in Turkey. And stay safe and take care, and hopefully, and I also invite every participant to read Hannah's book and then follow her Twitter account. I've been doing that for several days. It's good. And thank you, and thank you everyone for joining our webinar. And I guess for Tunis Society, we'll have further webinars on a wide range of issues, including foreign policies. And stay tuned. And thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Heina. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Bye. Okay.
Bye.